She was only 10 years old. A shy smile, bright eyes, and a secret she hid behind her hijab. In Woking, Surrey, neighbors thought she was safe at home. But the truth? She was trapped in a nightmare. One so brutal, her final days left over 70 injuries across her small body. Her death shocked the nation, but the horror didn't end there. The very people who should have loved her fled across continents, leaving behind a heartbreaking confession and an empty home. This isn't just the story of a crime. It's the story of how an entire system failed to save one little girl. And once you know the details, you'll never forget the name, Sara Sharif. Before the headlines and the courtrooms, before the vigils and the flowers on the pavement, Sara Sharif was a quiet little girl trying to find her place in the world. Born in the UK to a British mother and a Pakistani father, she grew up in Woking, Surrey, a town where neighbors still knew each other by name. At school, Sara was polite, bright, and a little reserved. Teachers noticed she smiled often, but sometimes avoided eye contact when certain questions came her way. Around her friends, she loved to draw, to write stories, and to watch videos of dancers online. But in the last year of her life, something changed. She began wearing a hijab to school. Not unusual in itself, but teachers and friends noticed she kept it on more often, even during lessons where she used to remove it. She said it was her choice, part of her faith. But some staff suspected there was more to it. One day, during a lesson, a teacher glimpsed what looked like bruising near her hairline. When asked, Sara offered a clumsy explanation and quickly adjusted her hijab to cover it again. Reports began to form. In June 2022 and again in March 2023, school staff raised safeguarding concerns to local authorities. But by April 2023, Sara was withdrawn from school altogether. Her father and stepmother said she would be homeschooled. That decision cut her off from the teachers who might have been her last line of protection. Neighbors later recalled that they rarely saw her outside anymore. The curtains in her room were often drawn, even on sunny days. And though the family sometimes appeared together in public, Sara's eyes looked distant, like she was somewhere far away, lost in thought. It's here, in this silence, that the first layer of tragedy begins. Sara's hijab had become more than a symbol of faith. It had become a shield, hiding injuries and pain that no child should endure. By the summer of 2023, Sara's life had narrowed to the walls of her home. What had once been a place of safety now became a place of fear, discipline, and pain. Neighbors rarely saw her outside. No one knew that inside, the cruelty had escalated to a level no child should ever endure. Witness accounts and court evidence later revealed a harrowing routine. Sara was tied up for punishment, beaten with a cricket bat, whipped with a belt buckle, burned with an iron, and even bitten. The injuries she sustained were not isolated. There were more than 70 in total, 25 of them fractures in various stages of healing. It was proof that her suffering had been prolonged, systematic, and relentless. She was 10 years old. Her stepmother was described as cold and controlling, while her father was explosive and unpredictable. The abuse didn't happen in shadows. It happened in her home, in front of her siblings, in an environment where violence had become a language. On August 8, 2023, the violence reached its final crescendo. No one outside the family knew exactly what happened in those last moments. What is known is that Sara's life ended in that house. Her small body left in a bunk bed for 2 days before authorities arrived. When her father called the police from abroad on August 10th, his words were chilling. He admitted, "I beat her up too much. I lost it." And in the house, investigators found a handwritten note. "I killed my daughter by beating. I lost my temper." Those words would echo through the courtroom months later, but in that moment, they were simply the final truth in a chain of horrors. When Sara's father made that fateful phone call to police from abroad, the truth began to emerge. But instead of facing the consequences, he, Sara's stepmother, and her uncle boarded a flight to Pakistan, taking the other children with them. The sudden departure stunned neighbors, family friends, and the authorities. In those first hours after Sara's body was found, the house on Hammond Road became a scene of quiet chaos. Forensic teams moved in, collecting evidence. The bunk bed where Sara's body had been placed, the handwritten note, and the lingering signs of a life lived under control and fear. Meanwhile, news outlets broadcast images of the suspects walking through airport security, carrying nothing that would reveal the enormity of what had just happened. In Pakistan, they stayed out of the public eye, avoiding cameras, interviews, and authorities. The manhunt quickly became international. British police worked with Interpol and Pakistani authorities, but extradition was complex. The case drew heavy media coverage, and questions about child safeguarding failures in the UK began to rise louder with each passing day. Why had no one been able to protect Sara? How could a child in contact with social services vanish from their watch? Then, in September 2023, a breakthrough. CCTV footage captured the trio at Heathrow Airport, returning to the UK with the other children. Waiting officers moved in quickly. The arrests were made in near silence. No resistance, no dramatic chase. Just the quiet inevitability of justice catching up. For the first time since her death, there was a sense that the truth might come to light. But for Sara's loved ones and the community, it was only the beginning of another painful chapter. One played out in the glare of the courtroom. When the trial began at the Old Bailey, the weight of the case hung heavy in the air. The public gallery was packed. Journalists, family members, and members of the community who had followed every grim update since Sara's death. In the dock sat her father, her stepmother, and her uncle, each facing charges that would bind them to her suffering forever. The prosecution laid out the timeline with painstaking detail, piecing together witness testimonies, forensic evidence, and the harrowing autopsy results. The images shown in court were not shared with the public, but those who saw them described the injuries as catastrophic and systematic. The medical examiner spoke of fractures in varying stages of healing, burn marks consistent with an iron, and injuries that could only have been caused by repeated blunt force. Sara's final days, as reconstructed in the courtroom, painted a picture of sustained cruelty. The prosecutor described how she was bound, beaten, and isolated. The emotional blow to the jury was profound. Several were visibly shaken as they listened to the testimonies. The defense attempted to shift blame, suggesting that certain injuries might have been accidental or caused by others in the household. But the mountain of evidence, phone records, the handwritten note, forensic findings, made their arguments thin and unconvincing. Throughout the trial, the defendants displayed varying demeanors. At times, the father stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact with the jury. The stepmother sat rigid, her face unreadable. The uncle looked pale, almost resigned. None of them, however, offered an apology that felt real to those who had loved Sara. When the verdicts came, the courtroom was silent. The father and stepmother were found guilty of murder. The uncle was found guilty of causing or allowing Sara's death. The judge, in a voice that cut through the stillness, condemned their acts as torture in plain sight. The day of sentencing felt different from the rest of the trial. Outside the Old Bailey, crowds gathered early, reporters adjusting cameras, protesters holding up signs with Sara's face, and members of the public silently waiting for justice to be delivered. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but resolute. The judge's voice was firm, each word deliberate as he spoke directly to the defendants. He called their actions an unforgivable breach of the duty every parent owes their child, describing Sara's treatment as a pattern of cruelty that amounted to torture. Sara's father and stepmother were sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term that would keep them behind bars for decades. The uncle, while receiving a lesser sentence, was also condemned for his failure to act. There was no applause in the courtroom, just a heavy silence, broken only by muffled sobs from Sara's relatives. Outside, the news spread quickly. Across the UK, social media lit up with anger and heartbreak. Hashtags calling for #SarasLaw began trending, demanding stronger protections for children known to social services. Politicians and child welfare advocates gave statements, promising reviews of safeguarding procedures. For Sara's loved ones, the sentences brought some measure of closure, but they also underscored an unshakable truth. Justice in court could never undo the years of pain she endured or bring her back. Months after the verdict, Sara's name still echoed in public conversations. In towns and cities across the UK, her story became a rallying cry for those demanding stronger safeguards for vulnerable children. The image of a smiling 10-year-old with bright eyes and a gentle face had become a symbol, a reminder of what happens when the system fails. Politicians debated new legislation under the banner of Sara's Law, proposing stricter monitoring of children in at-risk households and greater accountability for social services. Child protection charities used her case to campaign for better training, more resources, and faster intervention when abuse was suspected. At vigils, people spoke of Sara not just as a victim, but as a child whose life would inspire change. Her extended family, still grieving, thanked the public for their support, but urged that words must turn into action. "We cannot bring Sara back," one family member said, "but we can make sure no other child slips through the cracks like she did." Media outlets continued to revisit the case, producing documentaries and investigative reports. In each one, the unanswered questions lingered. How many signs had been missed? How could she have been saved? The answers were painful, but they kept the urgency alive. For those who had followed every detail, from the day Sara's disappearance made headlines to the sentencing of her killers, her story was no longer just a news item. It had become a moral obligation to remember, to protect, and to act. For more cases like this, and for more compelling true crime stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us bring you more stories that matter.